The curse had a sound. I had learned this over centuries, not from the elders, not from the Moon-Rites they performed in the great circle with their silver bowls and their chanting, but from the inside of my own chest, where the curse lived like a second heartbeat that was never quite in time with the first. A low, dragging pull. A cold weight behind the sternum. Not pain, precisely, something worse than pain. The feeling of a door that would not open, no matter how many hands pressed against it, no matter how many voices called through the wood. I had stopped listening to the elders 3 decades ago. They came every generation with new theories, a new elder, a new reading of the old texts, a new interpretation of what my ancestor had done to earn this seal on his bloodline. They were never wrong about the history. Corveth Drath, 7 generations above me, had taken something from the Moon Archive that was not his to take, a sealed record, a naming text, something so old the archive itself had no copy of what it contained. He had read it in secret alone, and the moon had answered him the only way it knew how. It had sealed his bloodline against the bond. No Drath heir would find his fated mate. The bond would not come. Generation after generation, my line had ruled Veilthorn without it, without the warmth, without the recognition, without the thing that every wolf in the hold took for granted. I had never felt it, not once. I stood in the archive vault at midnight and listened to the silence after the latest Moon-Rite had failed, and I thought, as I had thought before, perhaps it is simply not breakable. Perhaps Corveth earned this so completely that no amount of rite and ceremony will ever reach the root of it. Perhaps the Drath line ends with me, not through death, but through the simple, quiet erasure of never having anyone to hand it to. The elders were still in the great circle. I could hear them through the stone, the low murmur of voices recalibrating, redistributing blame, deciding which portion of the rite had been insufficiently pure. Elder Vorn would be the first to speak. He always was. He had been performing Moon-Rites for 60 years, and had the absolute certainty of a man who had never once had to admit he did not know something. I left them to it and walked down. The archive was 3 levels below the great hall, carved into the bedrock of Veilthorn's northern face. It had been here longer than the hold itself, longer, some of the oldest texts claimed, than the Drath line's tenure in this region. The stone was a different color down here, a deeper gray, and the cold had a different quality, not the biting cold of wind off the mountain, but the still, held cold of a place that had not been touched by changing weather in a very long time. My breath came out white in the candlelight. There were always candles burning in the archive, even at midnight. Marin kept them. Marin! I paused at the bottom of the stair, in the narrow corridor that opened into the first of the 3 vault rooms, and I listened. She was here. I knew this the way I knew most things about the archive, not because anyone had told me, but because in 12 years of walking these corridors I had learned the specific quality of silence that meant the archive was unoccupied, and this was not it. There was a faint sound from the 3rd vault, the turning of a page, the soft scrape of a stool on stone. Marin had been in the archive for 12 years. She had come as the assistant to the hold's appointed keeper, a man named Aldrich who had died of a winter fever in his 3rd year, and left behind approximately 40 unfinished catalog entries, and a set of keys that Marin had simply picked up and kept using. No one had formally appointed her. No one had issued a seal of office or a letter of appointment. The Elder Council had discussed it twice in 12 years, and concluded both times that they would take the matter up at the next meeting, and the matter had accordingly never been taken up at any meeting. Marin was, as far as the official records of Veilthorn were concerned, the archive's assistant. What she was, in practice, was the only person in the hold who knew where anything was. I had known this for years. I had come down to the archive dozens of times in the small hours, not for any particular text, but because the archive was the one place in Veilthorn where no one required anything of me, where no one brought me the next crisis, or the next failed rite, or the next diplomatic communication that needed a Lycan King seal. The archive asked nothing. Marin asked nothing. She looked up when I came in, sometimes nodded, sometimes said, "The Eastern Stack, third shelf, if you are looking for the Valethorn land surveys," or "The Corvath papers are still restricted, my lord," and then went back to her work. She was the only person in the hold who spoke to me as though I were simply a person who had come into a room, rather than the bearer of a centuries-old curse that everyone around me was either trying to fix or trying not to think about. I walked to the entrance of the third vault and stopped in the doorway. She was at the reading table. Candles at each corner, her catalog open beside a stack of folios. She was cross-referencing with the methodical patience that I had come to think of as essentially Marin: no hurry, no frustration, a kind of precise and steady attention that reminded me of watchmakers and surgeons. She had ink on the side of her left hand, which was usual. Her hair was pinned back from her face with a piece of cord, because she had lost the clasp she'd been using for the past month, which I knew because I had watched her search for it 3 weeks ago and not find it. She was wearing the same gray wool she always wore in the archive, because the vault held the cold and the wool held the warmth. She did not look up immediately. She finished the line she was reading, made a small note in the margin, and then looked up. "The rite failed," she said. "It was not a question." "The rite failed," I said. She absorbed this without visible distress. This was another thing about Marin. She did not perform emotion for my benefit. She felt things, I was fairly certain, but she felt them quietly and did not arrange her face into shapes designed to communicate them to observers. "Elder Vorn will want to examine the Corvath binding records again," she said. "I can pull them in the morning." "He has examined the Corvath binding records 14 times in the last 30 years. 15 times, she said. "I have them all logged." I came into the vault and sat in the chair across the table from her. This was not something I did often. Usually when I came to the archive at night I walked, or stood at the shelves, or read standing up with my back to the wall. But the failed rite had left something heavy in my chest, heavier than usual, the dragging pull of the curse amplified by the particular disappointment of having hoped, marginally, and been wrong again. And I did not want to walk. I sat, and I looked at the table, and after a moment Marin quietly moved the folio she had been reading to the side and left the space between us open. 12 years, I said. It was not directed at her specifically. It was the kind of thing that came out when the hold was quiet and the rite had failed, and the night had a very long way still to go. 12 years that I have been here, Marin said, and the curse for considerably longer. You are not counting from the same starting point. I know what I am counting from. 7 generations, she said, with the same tone she used for catalog entries. Corvath Drath's transgression is logged at 312 years ago, give or take the calendar adjustments. Elder Vorn's records put the first attempted rite at 308 years ago, which means the first attempt was made 4 years after the curse was set, and has accordingly been failing for 308 years. She picked up her pen and turned it over in her fingers, which was a gesture she made when she was about to say something she had been thinking about for a while. Though I note that the records of those early attempts are incomplete. What is missing? The original sealing text, she said. Or rather, the text is not missing. It exists. It is in the restricted vault. It has been in the restricted vault since Corvath's death, when his son ordered it sealed. Every elder since has noted it in the catalog and declined to open it, on the grounds that it caused the original transgression and should not be interfered with. She set the pen down. I have always wondered whether that is the correct reading of the situation. I looked at her. In 12 years, I had come to understand a number of things about Marin's way of speaking, and one of them was that, when she said, "I have always wondered," she had generally already reached a conclusion, and was waiting to see whether the person she was speaking to was capable of following her there. "You think the sealed text should be read?" I said. "I think," she said, with the precision of someone choosing every word from a very specific set, that the curse was made by a reading, and that every attempt to break it has avoided the original act, and that this may be why every attempt has failed. The silence in the vault was the particular silence of the archive, that deep, held quiet, 3 levels below the world, where even the wind from the mountain couldn't reach. The elders would not permit it, I said. No, she agreed, they would not. I looked at the doorway to the restricted vault. It was at the far end of the 3rd room, behind an iron door that had not been opened in, I counted, at least 60 years, since the last time Elder Vorn's predecessor had examined the outer catalog and decided the text should remain sealed. The key was kept in the Elder Council's chamber. I had a copy of every key in Valethorn. This was one of the facts about being Lycan King that the elders occasionally forgot, that the hold and everything in it was, technically, mine. The archive, the restricted vault, the sealed text. All of it was Drathland, Drath history, and the curse on the Drath bloodline was mine to attempt to break by whatever means seemed, to me, most likely to work. I stood, I went to the iron door. I took the key from the ring at my belt and I opened the restricted vault. The restricted vault was smaller than the others. A single room, 4 walls of shelves, a reading table at the center and one object on that table. A tome bound in leather so old it had gone the color of deep water, a gray-green-black that had no name in ordinary speech. The binding was sealed with a clasp that had no keyhole. The clasp was a piece of worked silver in the shape of a crescent moon, tarnished to near black, and it had not moved in 312 years. I brought Marin a candle and told her what I was asking. She stood in the doorway of the restricted vault for a long moment. Her eyes went to the tome. She had never been inside this room. The door had always been locked when she was keeper, and she was not the kind of person who pushed at locked doors. She looked at the tome the way she looked at difficult catalog problems, with full attention and without drama. You understand, she said, that I am not an elder. I have no formal appointment, no seal of office. If this works, the Elder Council will dispute my authority to have done it. If this works, I said, the Elder Council can dispute whatever they like. She looked at me. One of the things about Marin's eyes, a gray that shifted toward green depending on the candlelight, was that they were extremely difficult to read at certain angles and extremely easy to read at others. This was one of the easy ones. She was afraid, marginally, not of the tome, of being wrong, which was, I had come to understand, the thing Marin feared most, the specific failure of precision, the error in a carefully kept record. All right, she said. She went to the table. She sat. She put both hands flat on the cover of the tome, and I watched from the doorway, and nothing happened for the span of perhaps 10 breaths, and then the clasp moved. Not violently, not with any drama, it simply shifted. The silver crescent tilted, like a scale finding balance, and then released with a sound like a single clear note struck on a bowl, and the cover of the tome fell open. The pages inside were not paper. I could not have said what they were, something thinner, more translucent, with a faint luminescence that was not the candle's doing. The text was written in a script I recognized as Old Valethorn, the archaic form that Marin read better than any living elder because she had spent 12 years cataloging texts written in it. She looked at the first page for a long time. Her lips moved slightly, not reading aloud but sounding out, finding the shape of the words. Then she looked up at me. It is a naming text, she said, a record of the original bond seal. What Korvath took. She looked back at the page. He did not steal it to read it for himself. He stole it because the text named something. He wanted to know what it named. And what did it name? She read for another moment. The mate of the Drath heir, she said slowly, not a specific person, the nature of her, the qualities the moon chose, a record of what the bond is drawn to in the Drath line across generations. She turned a page. Her hands were steady. He read it, and the moon sealed him for it because the text was not meant to be read until the bond was ready to be made. Reading it early, reading it without the mate present, jammed the mechanism. Like reading the end of a locks combination, before the tumblers are in position. I stood very still in the doorway. The curse behind my sternum had shifted. Not gone, not yet, but altered, the way a sound alters when you step closer to its source. Less like a pull, more like a held breath. Can it be undone by reading it again? I said. The correct way, with whoever it names present. Marin was quiet for a moment. She turned another page. I think, she said very carefully, that whoever reads it aloud completes what Corvath interrupted. She set one hand flat on the page. I think the text reads differently depending on who is holding it. When Corvath held it alone, it named a quality, but the lock requires a voice, and she stopped. She looked at her own hand on the page. At the place where the silver text beneath her palm was doing something that text did not generally do, which was to glow. The glow was faint, warm gold, not harsh, the color of the bond mark in the old illustrations in the restricted archive, the ones drawn by Drath heirs in the early generations when the bond still existed in living memory and someone had thought to document it. Marin's hand was lit from beneath by the page. I crossed the vault in 4 steps, which was more quickly than I generally moved toward anything, and I stood at the opposite side of the table and looked at the page and at her hand and at the glow. It did not dim when I approached. It brightened, marginally. Read it aloud, I said. Sorvin, my name in her voice without title, which was not how Marin generally spoke to me, but the ordinary rules of address felt very far away in that moment. If I read this aloud and something goes wrong. Nothing has gone right in 312 years, I said. Read it. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at the page. And she read. Old Veilthorn had a sound unlike the common tongue. It sat lower in the chest, the vowels longer, the consonants struck rather than blown. Marin read it the way she did everything, precisely, without hurry, giving each word its full weight. The first line was the preamble, the formal acknowledgement of the moon's authority over the bond, and as she spoke it, I felt the curse pull in my chest shift again. A deeper shift this time, like something that has been immovable for a very long time discovering that it can, in fact, be moved. The second passage was the record of qualities. I heard them in Old Veilthorn first and understood them a breath later, the way translation works when you know a language well enough. Steadfast, precise, unmoved by fear of being wrong when the work requires it, gentle in the way of things that are strong enough not to need to demonstrate it. The text was not describing an ideal. It was describing a person. It was describing, with the specific and unflinching accuracy of a moon record, the person sitting across the table from me with ink on her hand and 12 years of uncredited work in her bones, reading a sealed text that 300 years of elders had flinched away from. I understood in that moment, with the particular quality of understanding that arrives not as a thought but as a recognition. The way you recognize a word you have always known the meaning of but have never heard spoken aloud, that Marin had been in my archive for 12 years. That the archive was mine. That she had been, by every logic the moon used, exactly where she was supposed to be. The third passage was the seal's release. I knew this not because I could read the Old Veilthorn as it appeared on the page, but because I felt it, felt the lock in my bloodline, the cold mechanism that had sat jammed and immovable for 3 centuries, begin to turn. The dragging pull behind my sternum, the sound that was not quite a heartbeat, altered completely. It stopped pulling and started. I had no other word for it, arriving. Something that had been withheld was returning. Something that should have been present from the beginning was stepping into the space it had always been meant to occupy. Marin's voice did not shake. She read to the end of the passage, and then she read the closing line, a single sentence in Old Veilthorn that meant, approximately, what was interrupted is now completed. What was taken out of sequence is now restored. And she set the last syllable down on the air of the restricted vault as cleanly as she set catalog entries into the ledger, with the finality of a thing that has been done correctly. The glow under her hand flared once warm gold, full and clean, and then settled. On my left wrist, through my sleeve, a heat that I had never felt before began. I pushed the sleeve back. The bond mark was there. I had seen illustrations of it in the old texts, a curving line, moon-shaped, that appeared on the wrist of a Drath heir when the faded bond ignited. In the illustrations it was always depicted as silver. Mine was gold. I looked at it for a moment and then I looked at Marin. She had her right hand turned over on the table, palm up, looking at her own wrist. The same curving line. The same warm gold. She was looking at it with the expression she used for archive problems that had turned out to have a solution she had not anticipated, not surprise exactly, because surprise implied that she had been confident in a different outcome, and Marin was rarely confident in outcomes. More like the careful absorption of new information by a person who intended to understand it fully before reacting to it. "This is the bond mark," she said, stating it, not asking. "Yes," I said. "The text named me." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. In the vault around us the candles burned steadily, and the glow from the tome's pages had settled to something softer, the luminescence of a thing that has finished its work and is resting. The tome's cover had not closed. It sat open to the final page, which was, I saw when I looked at it properly for the first time, blank, waiting, perhaps, for a catalog entry by the hold's keeper. "You did not know," she said. It was not an accusation. It was the same tone she used for correcting an incorrect archive reference, patient, without blame, simply making the record accurate. "I did not know," I said. "I came to the archive because the archive was quiet, because you were." I stopped, because she never asked anything of me. Because she spoke to me as though I were a person in a room, not a burden to be managed. Because in 12 years of her being the only constant in the archive, I had somehow failed to ask myself why her presence made the cold of the vault feel less cold. "I did not see clearly," I said. "I should have." "The curse was interfering," she said, "with the fairness of the archive record." The curse was not the only thing. She absorbed this, the way she absorbed everything thoroughly, without rushing toward a conclusion before the evidence was complete. The tome was open on the table between us. The bond mark was on both our wrists, warm gold in the candlelight. 312 years of failed rites were behind us in the history of the hold, and somewhere above us in the great circle Elder Vorn was still redistributing blame for the Moon-Rite's failure, unaware that in the restricted vault below him, the thing he had spent 60 years attempting had just been accomplished by the woman the Elder Council had been declining to formally appoint for 12 years. "Marin," I said. She looked at me. "I owe you an accounting," I said. 12 years of work in this archive, without appointment, without seal, without formal recognition from the council or from me. That is a debt. I would like to begin settling it if you will allow me to." She looked at me for a long moment. In the candlelight her eyes were the gray-green that meant careful thought. "That is not how faded bonds are generally described," she said. "In the texts." "I know how faded bonds are described in the texts," I said. "You have probably cataloged more of them than any living elder. I am not describing a bond. I am describing a debt, which is a different thing and which I intend to be honest about." The corner of her mouth moved. It was a very small movement, barely legible, but I had had 12 years of watching Marin's face from across a reading table, and I knew it for what it was. "All right," she said. It was the same thing she had said when I asked her to open the tome, the same quality of assent, considered and clear-eyed and freely given. I went to the doorway of the restricted vault, and I called up to the great hall. The elders came down. All 7 of them, Elder Vorn at the front with the particular bearing of a man who expects to find something that requires his management. And what they found instead was the restricted vault open, the sealed tome open on the reading table, and their Lycan king standing at the doorway with his left sleeve pushed back, and a gold bond mark on his wrist that none of them had ever expected to see in their lifetimes. Elder Vorn's eyes went to the bond mark, then to Marin, still seated at the reading table with her right palm turned up on the wood, the matching mark on her wrist catching the candlelight, then to the open tome, then back to me. "The sealed text," he said. "You opened the sealed text." "It is my archive," I said. "The text is my bloodline's history. I opened it." "The assistant," he said, and I noticed, as I had not noticed until tonight, the particular flatness with which he used the word, the way it occupied the space where a name would go. "Read from it." "Marin," I said, "read from it, the hold's keeper, yes." The silence in the vault had a different quality now than the held quiet of the archive in the small hours. This was the silence of 7 elders recalibrating, not redistributing blame this time, but confronting the specific discomfort of having spent 12 years in the same hold as the answer to the problem they had spent 60 years attempting to solve, without ever having looked at her directly. Elder Vorn was not, at his core, a dishonest man. He was a man who had never been required to question the category he had placed someone in, because the category had never before turned out to be so substantially wrong. I watched him look at the bond mark on Marin's wrist. I watched him look at the open tome. I watched him do the arithmetic of 12 years' worth of meetings at which the matter of the assistant's formal appointment had been deferred. He did not speak for a long moment. "The Korvath seal," he said finally to me, "it is broken." "Completely," I said. "Ask the curse. You will find it is no longer present." He looked at me and I let him look, because the bond mark on my wrist was visible and the tone of my voice was different from every other time he had spoken to me in 60 years of his elder service, and he could hear that, I thought. The dragging pull was gone from my chest, not suppressed, not temporarily quieted by the hope of the right as it sometimes was. Gone. The door had opened. The warmth that was arriving, that had been arriving since Marin's voice reached the last syllable of the release passage, was nothing like the right's brief, cold approximation of it. It was the real thing, bone-deep and unhurried, the feeling of a space that had been held open for 3 centuries being, at last, filled. Elder Vorn said, "I see." Which was, I thought, probably the truest thing he had said about the situation in a very long time. I let the elders make their examinations. Let Elder Vorn open the Korvath binding records and confirm against them that the curse seal markers were, as I had told him, absent. Let the younger elders look at the tome and at Marin's reading notes. She had begun making them, in the margins of her catalog, while the elders were descending the stair, because this was how Marin responded to significant events, by beginning to document them, and let them come slowly to the conclusion that what had happened was what had happened, and that there was no elder reinterpretation available that changed the basic fact of it. Marin sat at the table and answered their questions in the same tone. She answered all archive questions, patient, precise, without defensiveness. When Elder Vorn asked whether she had understood the risk of reading the unsealed text without elder authorization, she said that she had understood it and had proceeded at the Lycan King's direction and her own judgment, and that she was prepared to be accountable for that judgment in the morning, after she had finished her notes. One of the younger elders, Elder Sira, who had been in her post for 3 years and had, I had noticed, a somewhat different quality of observation than her colleagues, looked at the catalog pages Marin had open on the table, and then at the stack of cross-reference folios she had been working on before I came down, and then at the bond mark on her wrist, and then at me. "She has been keeping this archive alone for 12 years, Elder Sira said. "It was not directed at me precisely. It seemed to be directed at the room." "She has," I said. "The appointment was deferred." "Twice," I said, "at the council's decision." I did not intervene, which was my failure as much as the council's. Elder Vorn looked at me with the expression of a man discovering that the ground under a long-held position has shifted. He did not argue. He was not, as I had said, a dishonest man. He simply said, with the careful dignity of someone accepting an accounting, "The appointment can be formalized in the morning." "Tonight," I said, "it can be formalized tonight." The formalization was brief. As these things go when the Lycan King is present, and the bond mark is visible, and the Elder Council has just spent 3 hours looking at the evidence of their own extended error. Marin was given the seal of Veilthorn's headkeeper, not assistant, not interim, not acting by Elder Vorn's own hand, in the restricted vault with the open tome and the 7 elders as witnesses. She received it with the same composed attention she gave everything, looked at the seal for a moment, and then set it carefully on the table beside her catalog. "I will need the back records formalized as well," she said to Elder Vorn. 12 years of entries under the assistant's notation. They should be reattributed." "That can be," he began. "Tonight," she said, with the same even precision, "would also be acceptable for beginning it." Elder Vorn looked at her for a moment. Then, with the expression of a man discovering that things are going to be done differently from this point forward, he said, "Yes, I expect it would." The elders worked until near dawn. Marin supervised the back attribution from the reading table in the 3rd vault, directing Elder Vorn's secretary through 12 years of records with a patience that was, I noted, in no way gentle. It was simply thorough, and thoroughness does not pause for discomfort. I sat in the corner and did not interfere, because this was Marin's archive and Marin's 12 years, and the accounting was hers to oversee. The bond mark on my wrist was warm throughout, not hot, not urgent, simply present the way warmth is present in a room that has been properly heated for the first time after a long winter. The feeling of a thing that is where it is supposed to be. Near dawn, when the last of the Elder Council had gone back up to the great hall and Marin and I were alone in the vault again, she set down her pen and stretched her hands, the careful stretch of someone whose fingers have been working for hours, and looked at the bond mark on her wrist. "There will be a formal recognition," she said. "The hold will need to be told." "Yes," I said. "I have not," she paused. This was unusual. Marin generally did not begin sentences she did not finish. "I have not been in this hold, anyone has looked at directly," she said. "The archive is below the hall. I am in it. People come when they need a record and leave when they have found it. That is, I am accustomed to that." "I know," I said. "I was one of the people who came and left." "You stayed longer than most," she said. "I should have looked more clearly," I said, "at what I was staying for." The candlelight in the vault was lower now, the long, slow burn of candles that had been lit many hours ago and were approaching their ends. Marin reached out and replaced the nearest one with the quiet economy of someone who has maintained this archive alone through a very long succession of nights, who knows without looking which candles need turning and which will last until morning. "I do not require," she began, and then stopped again, and I waited, because this was important and Marin was being precise. "I do not require grand gestures," she said finally. "I do not require a ceremony of vindication or a public humiliation of the Elder Council on my behalf. What I require, what I would find," another pause. Marin, I had learned, was more articulate about archive matters than about matters that concerned herself, which was, I thought, something I intended to work carefully on changing. "What I would find sufficient," she said, "is to do my work properly, with the title and the authority the work requires, and to be seen doing it." "You will be," I said. "The hold will know the keeper's name, not the assistant's, yours." She looked at me across the reading table. In the low candlelight her eyes were fully gray now, clear and direct. "And the other part of this," she said, "the bond. I did not come down to the restricted vault tonight expecting to acquire a fated mate. I want to be clear that I am not proceeding with the expectation that Marin, I said. She stopped. I'm not asking anything of you, I said. The bond exists. It is on both our wrists and it is not going to be unwritten. But you are a person who makes careful decisions based on complete information, and you have had about 3 hours with this information, which is not complete information yet. I looked at her. I have been coming to this archive for 12 years and sitting across a table from you, and finding it the only place in Valethorn where I wanted to be, and I did not have the clarity to know why. I do not think I have earned the right to ask for your certainty in an evening. She was quiet for a moment. That is, she said, a very accurate description of the situation. I have had 312 years of practice at being in this particular hold, I said. I can be patient. The corner of her mouth moved again, more legibly this time. 312 years, she said, is rather a long precedent. Not all of it useful, I said. Some of it, I am now informed, could have been resolved considerably sooner if the correct person had been permitted to open the correct text. She looked at the open tome on the table. The pages were still luminous, faintly, the soft gold of a thing at rest. It would not have worked sooner, she said. The text said the bond ignites when it is ready to be made, not before. It is a timing mechanism, not a lock. Then it was ready tonight, I said. Yes, she said, tonight. The morning came slowly to Valethorn, the particular slow arrival of winter light through narrow stone windows, gray first and then gradually less gray, the kind of light that did not so much arrive as accumulate. I knew this light because I had spent 300 years watching it from various windows, and I had come, over those years, to think of it as one of the things the hold did that it did not do for anyone. That was simply the hold being itself, the stone and the cold and the slow patience of a very old place. I was at the window in the corridor, outside the archive, when Marin came up the stairs. She was carrying her catalog, the updated one, with the back attribution corrections Elder Vorn's secretary had made through the night, and she had the seal of the head keeper in the pocket of her gray wool, which I knew because the wool had a particular set to it now, a slight weight on the right side that had not been there before. She stopped when she saw me at the window. You stayed, she said. I stayed, I said. She looked at the gray light coming through the window for a moment. The bond mark on her wrist was, in this light, not the warm gold of the candle-lit vault but something quieter, more like the color of winter sunlight through cloud, muted and steady, and, I thought, exactly the color that Valethorn would have chosen for it if it had been given a preference. The hold's morning, she said. I like this part, before the hall wakes. It is the only time the corridors are as quiet as the archive. I know, I said. I have liked it for a very long time. I did not know what I was waiting for in it until now. She looked at me. In the morning light her eyes were fully gray-green, the reading light color, the color I had been looking at across a table for 12 years without looking at clearly. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "The hall will wake in an hour. Elder Vorn will want a formal announcement." "Elder Vorn will have one," I said. "And then there will be questions," she said, "about who I am, where I come from, what I did." She said this without distress and without particular enthusiasm, the same tone as the archive problem that has a solution, but the solution comes with a significant amount of subsidiary work. "Yes," I said. "And the answer to all of them is that the hold's keeper, who has been in the Valethorn archive for 12 years and has kept its records with a precision that no titled elder matched, read the text that 3 centuries of rites could not, and broke the Korvath seal, and the Lycan King's bond mark is on her wrist, and the hold will learn her name." Marin absorbed this. She looked at the catalog in her hands and then back at me. "You said last night that you were not asking for my certainty in an evening," she said. "I did." "I'm not certain," she said, with the carefulness of someone who has learned that precision is the first duty of honesty. I have never been in this, I have not had reason to be in this situation before, and I do not yet know all of what it means. But I know what the text said. I know what the mark means. And I know that you have been sitting in my archive for 12 years in the small hours and that I did not find it unwelcome. She looked at the bond mark on her wrist. That is not certainty. But it is a starting point, and I know how to work from a starting point. So do I said. She nodded, one small, decisive nod, the kind she gave when a catalog problem had been correctly identified and the work could now proceed. Then she said, "The morning record. I should go back down and complete it before the hall wakes." "I will walk with you," I said. She considered this for a moment, then, "All right." The announcement went as announcements go in Valethorn, formally, with Elder Vorn at the front because Elder Vorn was always at the front, and with the particular solemn weight of a thing that the hold had been expecting for 3 centuries, without knowing it was expecting it. I stood at the head of the great hall and I said, in the language that official announcements required, that the Korvath seal was broken, that the bond had ignited, and that the hold's head keeper, her name, her title, her 12 years of documented service, was my fated mate. The hall was full. Every wolf in Valethorn who could be gathered on short notice, which was most of them, stood in the great arched space with the morning light coming through the high windows, and made the sound that halls make when something that has been waiting for a very long time has finally arrived. Not quite silence. The specific quality of held breath resolving into released breath, 312 years of a curse being over, landing on the stone floor of the hall and the ears of the pack all at once. Elder Vorn, to his credit, said Marin's name correctly and in full, and called her by her title, and made no reference to the 12 years of deferred appointments. Marin stood beside me and received the pack's recognition with the composed attention she gave everything, not stiffness, not performance, but the genuine and full-hearted attention of someone who has waited a long time to be seen for what they actually are, and is now, at last, being seen, and is taking it in completely rather than letting it wash past. When the formal part was done, and the hall had broken into the particular warm disorder of a significant morning, one of the younger wolves, a girl of perhaps 15, one of the hall pages, who had almost certainly run messages to the archive more than once in the past years, without knowing the name of the woman who received them, came forward through the crowd, and looked up at Marin with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to be indirect about things that interest them. "You broke the curse," she said, "with a book." "With a text," Marin said. "There is a distinction, though it is not urgent this morning." "Did you know you could?" the girl asked. Marin considered this with the same precision she brought to everything. "I thought the logic held," she said. "The curse was made by a reading. It seemed possible that it could be unmade by one. I was not certain." "But you did it anyway." "The alternative," Marin said, "was to leave it undone." The girl looked at her for another moment, absorbing this, and then turned and ran back into the crowd the way hall pages run, all at once completely, with the whole body. Marin watched her go. "She will come to the archive," I said. "Probably," Marin said. "I will put her to work." The weeks that followed were the weeks of the adjustment, which was what I privately called the period during which the hold recalibrated to the fact that the Lycan King's fated mate was the woman who had been sitting in the archive 3 levels below the hall for the past 12 years. This recalibration took various forms. Some wolves came to the archive for the first time in years, ostensibly to locate records, actually to look at Marin, which she tolerated with patient precision, answering their archive questions and ignoring the ones that were about her. Elder Vorn had the back attribution corrections formally entered into the council's record, which was done without ceremony and without comment, which was, I thought, probably the best Elder Vorn was capable of managing, and was sufficient. Elder Sira began dropping by the archive regularly, not for records, but because she and Marin had apparently found a shared interest in the older cataloging conventions that I did not entirely follow but was glad existed. And I came down to the archive in the evenings, as I had always come, but differently now. Not standing at the shelves with my back to the wall, sitting across from Marin at the reading table, where there was a second chair that had always been there but had generally been occupied by stacked folios, which were now on the shelves because the shelves were now properly organized, which they had not been under Aldrich and had been under Marin since the first year. She was teaching me Old Veilthorn. This was her suggestion, offered in the same practical tone she used for catalog corrections. If you are going to be in the archive in the evenings, it is more useful if you can read the texts than if you cannot. And I had agreed, because she was right, and because it gave me a reason to sit across from her with a difficult text between us and ask her questions, which turned out to be one of the things I was most content doing. She was a patient teacher, precise, without impatience for error, but also without the kind of false encouragement that lets errors persist. When I mispronounced a word, she corrected me once clearly and moved on. When I correctly parsed a difficult passage, she acknowledged it without excessive praise, a nod, sometimes, yes, that is right. And this, I found, made the praise she did give feel like an accurate report rather than a performance, which was more valuable than any amount of enthusiastic encouragement would have been. The bond mark on my wrist was warm every evening. Not more warm when she was close, not less when she was across the room. It did not behave the way the right description suggested it would, with temperature tied to proximity. It was simply consistently warm, the way the vault was consistently cold, a condition of the place. Marin's was the same, she told me, steady, present, a fact about the world that she was still her word incorporating. She was honest about this. This was one of the things I had known about Marin from across the reading table for 12 years and had not examined clearly until now. She did not perform emotions for the comfort of her audience. When she was uncertain, she said so. When she had not finished deciding something, she said she had not finished. When she found the bond's warmth, the specific quality of it, the thing I had described once as the feeling of a door opening, she said, "I think I understand what you meant now, about the door." And then she went back to the text she had been reading, because that was how Marin indicated that a significant thing had been said, by saying it precisely, and then letting it stand. On a night in the third week, when the archive was quiet and the candles were low, and I had been attempting a translation of a mid-period land record that was giving me considerable difficulty with its irregular verb conjugations, she set down her pen and said, "May I ask you something?" "Yes," I said. "When you were here in the small hours," she said, "in the years before tonight, did you, was it," she paused, in the way she paused when she was being precise about something that was difficult to be precise about, "did the archive feel different to you than the rest of the hold?" "Yes," I said, "it has always felt different, quieter, more, I looked for the word that was accurate rather than the word that was available. More mine, in some way I did not understand, despite the fact that technically the whole hold is mine." "I have always felt the same about it," she said, "since the first year, that it was particularly itself, that the cold in it was different from the cold upstairs, that the quiet was different." She looked at the vault around them. "I suppose the text would say that was the bond beginning, a very long, very slow beginning." "A patient bond," I said. "A thorough one," she said. "It documented itself across 12 years and waited for someone to read the record." I looked at her. In the candlelight she was what she had always been in this vault, which was wholly present and wholly herself, and I was only now equipped to understand what that had meant. Every night I had come down here and found it the only place in Veilthorn I wanted to be. "Marin," I said, "I am finished not looking clearly." She met my eyes, the careful attention, the gray-green steadiness. "I know," she said. "I would like to tell you," I said, that what you are is not a keeper of records who turned out to have a bond mark, or a solution to a 3-century problem, or a convenient answer to the curse. You are who you are, which is the most precise person I have ever encountered and the steadiest, and the one who read a text that 60 years of elders could not bring themselves to open because the work required it. And I paused because I was being precise in the way Marin had taught me without hurry. I would like you to know that the hold is better with your name on it, not the bond. The hold, Veilthorn, is better. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she used for correct archive entries, "That is accurate." "I know," I said. She picked up her pen, set it down again. "Sorving," she said. "Yes. I have finished not being certain," she said. The spring came to Veilthorn the way spring always comes to stone holds in the north, slowly, and with negotiation, the cold retreating room by room from the hall, and only arriving at the archive levels around the time the mountain passes opened. Marin noted the temperature change in the vault in her daily record. I know this because I read her daily records now. She had given me access to the catalog in the 4th month, after my old Veilthorn had improved to the point where I could read the older entries without misattributing them, and the daily records were at the back, the small running account she kept of the archive's condition. Temperature, candle inventory, visitor log, work completed. She had been keeping these records for 12 years. I read 12 years of daily records in the evenings while she worked. She did not ask me what I was doing. She already knew, because there was very little that happened in the archive that Marin did not know, and because the record was the record, accurate, precise, and for reading. The visitor log for the first 3 years had very few entries. My name began appearing in it in year 4. Like in King, small hours, no request made, departed without incident. This was the entry for every visit, identical, night after night, year after year, with the patient precision of someone maintaining an accurate count of a thing they had been told was not significant. The entries did not editorialize. They did not note that the visits were frequent or that the duration of each visit was longer than any other visitor's. They simply noted, the Lichen King came, no request made, departed without incident. I counted the entries. There were 267. I sat with this for a while in the quiet of the vault, with the bond mark warm on my wrist and the catalog open on the table, and the sound of Marin's pen on the page of the ledger she was working on. Then I looked up and said, 267 visits in 8 years. Marin did not look up from her ledger. 271, she said. You missed 4 in the winter of year 6 when the northern pass was closed. I looked at her. She continued writing in the ledger. The candlelight was on her face, and the bond mark was on her wrist, and the archive was exactly as cold as it always was, which was to say completely cold and entirely correct. You kept count, I said. I keep accurate records, she said. It is the work. Marin. She looked up, the gray-green eyes steady and clear in the candlelight, a small pause, and then, yes, she said, I kept count, without elaboration, without performance, in the tone she used for accurate reports. It mattered, she said, that you came. I set the catalog down. I looked at her across the table, the reading table in the 3rd vault, the one she had sat at every night for 12 years, the one that had a second chair that now had my coat on it because that was where I left my coat when I came in. I looked at her and I thought about 271 visits in 8 years, logged in the small, careful hand of the hold's keeper, and I thought about the bond mark and the curse and the sealed tome, and all 312 years of the draft line failing to find what it had, apparently, been circling for at least 8 of them without the clarity to know it. It mattered, I said, that I had somewhere to come to. She held my look for a moment, then she said, Then we are agreed. We are agreed, I said. She picked up her pen. I picked up the catalog. Outside the archive, somewhere above in the hold, the spring was arriving, room by room from the hall downward. It would reach the archive in a few weeks. Marin would note it in the daily record, precise and accurate. The temperature change logged the morning she felt it. I would read the entry in the evening and sit across from her at the table, and the archive would be exactly as it had always been, cold and quiet, and the only place in Valethorn I had ever found I wanted to be. The door, which had been jammed for 312 years, was open. I did not think about closing it again.